Hello and welcome to the fourth session here at Grad Ireland Live. At the Grad Ireland Graduate Careers Fair Live. This session is about how to explain gaps on your CV. And we'd like to welcome Carmel Morrissey, who's a career and mindset coach at Equilibrium Coaching, who's here to talk to you about building confidence in your story when you're explaining gaps in your CV. We have a poll to run alongside Carmel's session. And we're just wondering, we've all lived through quite a rather unique 18 months, and some students and graduates have had, internships postponed or graduate roles delayed or cancelled. So if you're in that position, please just let us know if you've had an internship or graduate role delayed or cancelled during the pandemic. Just let us know on the poll there. So I'm going to leave you in Carmel's capable hands, and I will come back in about 20 minutes and we will come up with some questions then to put Carmel's way. So please put them in the chat as you listen to the presentation. Thanks so much. Carmel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Rory. Hi, everyone. You're very welcome here on this lovely Friday cold afternoon. I'm going to be with you for the next 20 minutes talking to you about how to address a gap in your CV. And this is a question that comes up time and time again, and it's actually something that seems to be relevant regardless of where somebody's at in their career. So what I want to do is I want to talk to you about how to address some of the key areas that can maybe cause a gap. But really what I want to do is talk to you about how important it is to have a story, and how so much around addressing the gap in your CV is actually about you being confident in the story that you tell. So I'm going to take you through some strategies and tips that you can hopefully implement to help you build that confidence in your story. And then at the end, there's going to be some time for questions. So if I can help anybody, so maybe start thinking about your questions now. So I'm going to start just by introducing myself so you know where I'm coming from in terms of the tips and strategies that I'm going to give you. As Rory said, my name is Carmel and I've been a career and mindset coach for the last 12 years. I actually remember being at Grad Ireland. I had a CV business back in 2010 and I had a stand and did a presentation. So I've been around for a while. So a little bit of my background is really in terms of what I do on a daily basis. I'm a career and mindset coach, as I said. So I work with people who want to maybe change careers, are not sure what they want to do. Maybe they're sure what they want to do, but they don't know how to get there. I work with people who want to let go of negative beliefs, who feel stuck, who want to build confidence. So I work a lot in those kind of areas, and I work from undergrad all the way up to C-suite. I'm also a confidence coach, so I have a background in strategic solution-focused hypnotherapy. So I use a lot of strategies from that to help people to access their confidence. And I'm going to just touch on that a little bit today. I'm also a CV and interview coach. So as I said, I set up a CV business back in 2011. It no longer exists. I couldn't write any more CVs. I didn't have any more in me. But it was called Fast Track CVs. And then I became a CV and interview coach. So I used to work with a company called Clearview Coaching. I did a lot of coaching work on my own, and I would have popped up at a lot of these types of events. I was the interview expert for Recruit Ireland as well, so I would have written a lot of the older articles that were there a couple of years ago. I also have a couple of online courses, so I do lots of different things. And if you're interested in connecting with me, feel free to do that on LinkedIn or check out my website, which is equilibriumcoaching.ie. But really, obviously, the reason that I'm here today is to talk to you about gaps in CVs. For me, the three common areas that really seem to cause a gap in a CV are somebody returning to education, somebody that's made redundant, or maybe somebody caring for a family member and taking a little bit of time out. Now, when I was a recruiter, so prior to my CV business, I studied psychology, work psychology, and worked as a recruiter for a couple of years. And when I was a recruiter, we were told that if somebody had a gap in their CV to dig. So it was almost like you got a little pick and you had to dig and dig and dig and dig, and it was something to be suspicious of. And the good news is actually when the last recession came around for me, that's when we really started to embrace gaps in CVs. That's really when they started to become kind of normal. So possibly it hasn't affected you. Maybe you were still in school at that time, but certainly I'm sure you have siblings or parents, or maybe you were affected by the last recession, in which case a gap became almost normal, in the sense of most people had some kind of gap. So we started to change, or we started to see a change in attitudes to gaps even back then. With the last 18 months, with COVID, a gap has become, again, something that is really commonplace. And what I really want to talk to you about today is that you don't allow that gap to be a chip on your shoulder, that it isn't something that erodes at your confidence, that it isn't something that prevents you from applying for roles, but that instead you take a step back and ask yourself, how can I talk about this gap? How can I talk about this gap in a way that's going to be meaningful to the person that's sitting opposite me, bearing in mind that they possibly also have somebody who's been affected by a gap in their CV. So the first thing that I really want to make clear today is that gaps have almost become normalized. There isn't the same stigma attached. So in terms of the types of gaps, as I've said, returning to education is quite a common one that I would see, where maybe somebody has worked for a few years, maybe they decided to have a career transition, so they've gone back to study, or maybe there was a year or two while they were made redundant and they took some time out to really assess and think about what was the right next step for them. So that's a very common type of gap. And then obviously caring for family members, that's something that's becoming more and more common as well. And I think it's something that our employers are really starting to accept, again, as normal, where somebody would maybe leave a career or leave education to look after a family member for a couple of years. And that it was something that maybe really aligned with values, or maybe there was no option but to take that time out to care for a family member. And when I talk about family members, that can be somebody with small kids who made the decision early on that they wanted to be that stay-at-home parent, and that they were going to maybe take a step back from their career and stay at home with the kids until they were a little bit more self-sufficient and then return to work. Or it could be somebody who's taking time out to care for maybe an elderly parent. So these are all the kind of gaps that can pop up on a CV. So now that we've talked about gaps, I want to talk to you about how you might address them. The other thing is, obviously with COVID, people have had internships cancelled. Maybe you were due to start a role and the role was pulled because the company didn't have the budget, or they didn't know if they were in a position to increase headcount. So obviously they're the kind of gaps that maybe we wouldn't have been looking at prior to COVID, but are now becoming more commonplace as well. So now that we've addressed the gaps, I want to talk to you about how you bridge the gap. And for me, that's what it is about. So we can't change your history. We don't have a way that we can take away the gap. But what we can do is we can look at a way to weave it into your story. And for me, from a CV perspective, or certainly from an interview perspective, you need to know what your story is in advance of your CV and cover letter, or in advance, certainly, of sitting down in an interview. And owning your story is really, really important. So how do you bridge the gap in your CV? So there's a couple of really practical things that you can do. The first thing, we're going to look at the one in the middle. We're going to talk about your CV. For me, the top 1/3 is the most important space on your CV. So if you think about, traditionally, we were told that people spent about 30 seconds looking at a document. We now know that it's about 7. So what I want you to think about is, think about any time you had to read a journal article and you were trying to decide if this article was the right fit for your assignment or not. The first thing that you would do is you would read the abstract. And that abstract would really give you suitability at a glance. And I want you to think about your CV in exactly the same way. So if you have a gap on your CV and you don't have a strong profile at the top, the chances are you are leading straight into your CV, starting with either your work experience or your education. So it's a chronological CV. And what I'm seeing first is your work experience and possibly a gap. So what you're doing is you're highlighting it. What I would like you to think about is a profile at the top of your CV that is a paragraph format, that is reverse engineered around the type of role that you're going for. So you're pulling out your key skills, competencies, attributes that you know that they're looking for. And what that means is if you have a gap in your CV, and let's imagine your relevant experience is 5 years ago, but you've had a gap for the last 2 years, there's every chance that your most relevant experience is going to be further down the CV. What using a profile does for you is it allows you to pull your relevant experience to the top of your CV from anywhere on your CV. So it means they're bought into you. They're psychologically ticking the boxes before they're even noticing that there's a gap in your CV. So create a strong profile that is reverse engineered around the role that you're going for. Pull your key skills from your CV to the top so that that gap isn't noticed until it's further down the CV. The next thing that's a really practical tip is to move all of your dates to the right-hand side of your page. So if you think about it, we read left to right. If you run the dates, so the dates for your employment on the left-hand side of the page, then the first thing that I'm going to see when I look at your CV is a gap. Move your dates to the right-hand side of the page, and it means I can see the employment, I can see the role, possibly before I even notice the gap. So again, I'm bought into it. The next thing then is think about how you're addressing the gap in your CV. And so if you went traveling for 3 years, rather than have a gap that doesn't demonstrate anything, then I would include traveling from this date to this date, key roles included, and just list the roles underneath. Everything that you do is transferable. There is not one role that you cannot pull transferable skills out of. But again, you have to know your story. So you have to know how you're going to sell these transferable skills that you acquired while you were traveling, and whether that be soft skills, and I don't like to call them soft skills because I think they're essential skills, emotional intelligence, flexibility, adaptability, experience working in multicultural environments, languages. So there's lots of things that can be pulled out of something like traveling. Caring for a family member at home, I would include that in the CV. So I would own that part of the story. And when I get to interview, I would sit back and I would talk about it. And how I would address it is the elevator pitch. So when you're asked, tell me about yourself, and you give qualifications, education, number of years of experience, key areas that you've worked in, attributes, and the reason you've applied for the role. So as you can see from my CV, I have a gap. And this gap is because I've spent the last 4 years at home looking after my small kids, and that was something I really wanted to do. I'm now in a position where I have a great support system, and I'm so excited about this next chapter of my career. Own your story. Similar, looking after family members, exactly the same thing. The next thing that you can think about is LinkedIn. So your CV is where you've been and LinkedIn is where you're going. So again, if you have a gap and you think that it could potentially weaken your case, then think about a really strong LinkedIn profile. Put your URL at the top underneath your contact details. William Fry did a study 5, 6, probably it may actually be 6 or 7 years ago, and they looked at how recruiters use social media while they were hiring. And at the time, they found that 1 in 2 recruiters searched for you on social media before they reviewed your CV a second time. Obviously, LinkedIn was not the first place they went to, so do a social media audit, just if you are looking for work. But we do know they go to LinkedIn. So by you providing that URL, you're actually in a way bringing them to where you want them to go. So have that strong profile on LinkedIn. Consider that you have a personal brand. And the thing about a brand is you create it intentionally or unintentionally. Intentionally is when you know what you want someone to think or feel when they land on your LinkedIn page, and you've thought about the problem that you solve, how you solve it, who you solve it for. And unintentionally is, I haven't finished my LinkedIn profile. I don't really use it. I don't really know what I want it to do for me. They're still going to land on the page, but it's not necessarily going to be the impression that you would want to give them. So to recap on that, own your story, know your gap, own your gap, and talk about maybe the benefits of the gap. Maybe you took some time out to assess what you wanted to do next. You figured out what that was, and now you're really excited about what's ahead of you because you know this is where you want your career to be. So own it. Confidence. Confidence is something that we cultivate. A really strong profile at the top of your CV, super important. Top 1/3 is the most important space. Pull those key skills from anywhere on your CV, put them in the profile, have them bought into you before they even notice a gap. Dates to the right-hand side, so the gap is not that obvious. Also, don't forget to see your CV as a living document. And what I mean by that is that for some people, they may go profile, work experience, education, because maybe work experience is stronger than education. If your education is stronger and more relevant than your work experience, then lead with your education, bulk it out. So include your projects, include your key modules. And again, then maybe you're helping to disguise that gap a little bit more. So fill it with what you do have and don't get hung up on what you don't have, which brings me to mindset. So our mind is always listening. And I'll give you a really clear example. For those of you who are watching, I'd ask you to just close your eyes for a moment, put your hand out in front of you, and I want you to imagine that in your hand you have a slice of lemon. And that lemon has just been sliced and it's really juicy. And what I want you to do now is bring your hand literally up to your mouth and imagine that you're biting into that lemon. And just take a moment to notice how juicy the lemon is. Notice the fragrance, notice the taste, notice the juice. And I promise you that if you do that later, or if you haven't done it right now, you'll notice that generally we start to get saliva in our mouth. Or some people will scrunch their faces because they don't like lemons. And the reason that's happening is because we're telling our mind that we have a lemon. Our mind is telling our body to start producing saliva to break down the lemon, when in reality, we all know that we don't have a lemon in front of us. And what I'm trying to show you is that our mind is always listening to what we're telling it. So if you're telling yourself that that gap is going to get you stuck, that you can't be confident about that gap, that it's going to be a block for you, then what will happen is your mind will tell your body, you create the narrative, you create the physiology, and then you become anxious and tense, and actually talking about it in an interview can even become quite difficult. So what I want you to do is look at the ways that you can explore that gap. If a friend came to you and said, I have this gap in my CV, is it going to get me really stuck? Every possibility that you would say no, and you would help them to sell that gap. Step into those shoes. See this as a project. See this as something that you need to sell for someone else, and see then how you would approach it. And look at all the different ways that you can flip the script, and that you can start to look at ways to move forward, but don't let the gap get you stuck, because gaps are normal. People take years out, people have life events, people have children, people change careers. You know, that ladder is gone, that where we went onto a ladder and we did the same job for the rest of our lives. People decide, make decisions based on what the next chapter of their life is going to look like. And it might mean that you have gaps and you take a step away to assess. But as I said, own it, be confident about it, flip the script, pay attention to your CV, own your story in interview. And remember, LinkedIn is where you're going, your CV is where you've been. So you've got a lot of freedom with LinkedIn as well to really start to build a brand and to move away from the gap. So I'm pretty much done, Rory, if you want to see if there's any questions.
We've got plenty of questions, Carmel.
Okay.
Thanks so much for that. Really insightful and a lot of food for thought there. And Nice little exercise as well in the middle of it. First exercise we've had today, which is good.
The lemon is a brilliant one. It's also a really good thing if anyone's got small kids, and any kid actually, and they want to show them the impact of their thoughts. It works with all ages, and I get saliva in my mouth every time I do it, so it never stops working.
We've got some questions here, and obviously they're like every question we get every seminar is very specific to one person's situation. But for this chat, it's even more specific because obviously those two lives are the same. And let's go through them. We have an attendee here who was an accountant who came to Ireland in 2009 during the recession, which made it almost possible to get a job, obviously. Then she started a family, and actually, I don't know if he or she was starting a family in his 12 years and finding it hard to find a job now to re-enter the workforce. What advice would you have for someone in that situation about where they can put their mind or what they can draw upon to help them get through this?
Okay, so it's hard without having all the facts, but let's assume they want to go back into accountancy, and
yes,
they're studying at the moment.
We don't know that. We don't know that. I would assume, yeah, I mean, they are accountants, so they're obviously qualified. Okay.
So a couple of things. A really good way to refresh a CV is actually to get a new qualification. And, you know, maybe your ACCA, or I'm not suggesting that you go and do a whole new qualification, but that you look at the niche in the marketplace, data analytics, you know, something that you can add to your CV that means suddenly there's something that's really up to date. Also, 12 years. So 12 years to raise your family is not an insane amount of time to be away from the workplace. What I would do is create a really strong profile around the experience that you do have. Then, if you can, I would look at a course. Springboard is amazing. So, you know, if you're in a position that maybe you need to go back to work and find a job and you want to study as well, I think it's 10% of the fees if you're working, and it's free if you're not. But something like data analytics would be something that would really freshen up your qualification and make you very interesting in the current marketplace. But again, don't let that get you stuck. Do not let a gap get you stuck. Look at what you probably have achieved during the 12 years in terms of managing your kids and your household and your emotional intelligence and multitasking. So own that story, but lead with a really strong profile and think about getting some additional education. Okay. And what about a gap caused by a voluntary, like say you took a year out and you just traveled after graduation, potentially due to burnout following a particularly tough course or a final year? How do you kind of explain that? Where literally you didn't really focus on your career, you just focused on yourself. Okay. So I wouldn't mention burnout, firstly. That was in the question. Yeah, okay. Because that can be a red flag. So what's really important is when you're going to interview, especially, that you understand that the person sitting opposite you is assessing you. And they don't know you. And when you talk about burnout, their perception of burnout might be completely different to what actually happened. So be very careful that you're not ambiguous when you're talking about those kind of things. So instead, sell it. So sell that, you know, when you came out of your course, you really wanted to take some time to step away and think about what you actually wanted to do with the rest of your career. And traveling gave you that freedom, you know, allowed you to step outside your comfort zone, develop these new skills. And now you're in a position where you know what you want, and then focus on that, focus on the enthusiasm about moving forward. It also means you've probably gotten it out of your system. So from an employer's perspective as well, that's also a plus. And I would think someone who's taken a year out to travel has had a huge amount of experience that they can now bring to the table. And in terms of someone who's, the question here, how would you recommend accounting for a gap in your CV due to poor mental health? Yeah, so take a gap because of mental health. So you have two options. You can be very honest, but again, I would be careful about how much detail you give. My feeling, and this is my personal feeling, so again, this is maybe how I would look at it. I would maybe think about whether I was taking a gap because maybe I wanted to look at making a change in my career. Because if maybe something wasn't working for you in that organization or in that role, so maybe it was an opportunity for you to take a step back and think about what you wanted to do next in your career, and you were in a position where you could take some time to do that, really assess, figure out what would work best for you, and you're really excited to be moving forward with it. Okay. And
for someone who's had, you know, repeat medical procedures, repeat medical appointments, and had to take a year off college, but they still got their degree. How do they kind of account for that gap during their studies, without downplaying the degree that?
Yeah,
you know,
and also it's always a hard one, because it's how honest, you know, should we be if we've had medical issues. I think I would be honest with it, but if the issue is resolved, I would be very clear that the issue is resolved.
Okay.
You know, so during college, I had some medical issues that involved some surgeries and some time out, but actually it was a really good opportunity for me to develop skills in multitasking, because obviously I was away from college a bit. I still had to achieve my grades. I did. It showed me how resilient I was. The issues are resolved, and I actually think I learned a lot during that year that would make me really valuable.
So the focus should be on what was achieved rather than the gap. Yeah.
Yeah. Always focus on the positive, and always, if there's a lack of experience, make up for it with enthusiasm. That's the other side of it.
That was good advice. Yep. Someone else here. I've had a gap between my graduation, the time I pursued my master's, and I was looking for admissions to international universities, and I wasn't successful. The rest of the time I was investing in the process for trying to get into international universities. How can I make this gap sound more sensible, or can I just stick to the truth and explain what I was trying to do?
Yeah, I would stick to the truth, but I would make it seem very deliberate, in that I was really adamant that I was going to get a program that I really wanted. And so I put a lot of time and effort into finding the right course for me, the right master's for me. And I did. And I'm really excited to be sitting here today having completed it.
Okay. And just as an interesting one, this it's a bit more of a CV structure question rather than a gap, but I just your perception of it. Someone's talking about the experience they picked up working during the summer over the course of a few years. Should they start with 21 and go back, or start with 18 and move to 2018, for example, and move forward?
Always start with your most recent.
Yeah.
But remember, I said that, I hope I said CVs are like living documents. So if somebody had work experience over the summer and it was really just to earn money, then when they're creating their CV for next summer, they might lead with that experience because they want another job to make money. But when they're going out and looking for maybe the first step in their career, they probably will lead with their education and bulk that out. Also, when you're going through your work experience, people say to me all the time, it's not relevant. You know, I did these jobs and it's not relevant. But like I said earlier, it's all relevant, but it's your job to sell it. Yeah. So working in a bar, anyone who works with customers, I mean, you can do anything if you can work with customers. That's how I feel about it. So, you know, sell it, but don't expect them to pick that up. Your job is to position it, so put it in your profile in such a way that they feel like they're getting someone who's more than their education. It also means you have a proven history of getting up and going to work in the morning. And that's really important as well. You're less of a risk. And
graduates and students, it's very hard when they're starting out in their career, and that, you know, people are always looking for experience, but, you know, to get experience, you need to get a job. And, you know, it's the catch-22. So if someone has graduated, they still haven't been successful in finding a job, and they're going like, well, I graduated last year, and now I'm saying in the CV, and they're probably wondering, what have I been doing? And what I've been doing is trying to get a job. How do you constructively, you know, explain that rather than explain what's obviously been a series of, you know, either they haven't been successful in a series of applications. So how do you explain that?
Yeah, so two things. First thing, if someone's sending out a CV over and over and over again and not getting a response, look at your CV. So people will say all the time, you know, there's no jobs. No, obviously in some sectors it's harder than others, but always look at what you can control. And you can't control availability of jobs, but you can control what you're sending out. And in most cases, there's probably a couple of things that could be done to the CV to make them better. Then in terms of how do you explain that to an employer? I would own it. I would say that I was really looking for the right next role, and I spent time looking for that. If you can, you know, if you think it's going to take maybe a year to find a job, again, I'd still look at doing little courses. So you have something to talk about as well. Volunteering, employers love social responsibility. So all these things that you were doing while you were looking for work. But if you're struggling looking for work, look at your CV, look at your LinkedIn. Two really, really important things that you can control straight away, and your cover letter. Sure.
And, you know, I suppose as well, it's because the old definition of insanity, you know, if you're sending out the same CV again and again, and, you know, take a fresh look at it, go to your careers advisors. They will help you from 3 years after graduation. Get someone who's never seen your CV before to read it. Say, does that sound like you?
And also the starting point with a good CV is, and people don't do this enough, and I coach up to C-suite and they still don't do it sometimes, collect job descriptions. So get 3 or 4 job descriptions for the type of role that you're going for. Get your pen, underline the keywords, ask yourself, what are they actually saying they want? Go onto the company website, look at how they describe the people that they hire. Grad Ireland, I mean, this is the perfect place, the perfect platform to look at company profiles and look at how they describe the people that they hire. Bring that back to your own CV. CVs are just psychology. You're just stepping into their shoes, giving them what they want, and they don't know you're doing it.
Yeah, and I mean, since you mentioned it, we'll give ourselves a plug here that we've recently relaunched gradireland.com and a brand new platform just this week. So please do visit it, please do update your profile, and do visit the job descriptions. They're one of the most popular sections, and it's great for a CV, for a job application, just to read through the keywords that are involved that you can put in your CV. Do it.
And even in terms of
there for.
and even in terms of if you don't know exactly where you're going to go with your qualification, it tells you, it shows you. I don't know what the new one looks like, but I certainly know what the older ones were like, and they were amazing.
So, and in terms of two more final questions, so if you can hang on just a minute, Carmel. Here's the opposite, and this is someone who's obviously quite experienced, and I can see how this can be an issue. They feel they have too much on their CV. There's too much experience. There's too much going on there. How far back do you go, or how do you prune it without creating gaps, obviously, that are going to cause issues?
Yeah. So don't get hung up on the 2-page CV. I think a CV needs to be as long as it needs to be, but it's quality over quantity. So what I would do is have a master template, and that master template is where you have everything in it, and then you edit that CV for the role that you're applying for. So use the job description of the role that you're going for to actually tailor the CV the whole way through. And if you have a lot of repetition early on in your career, then obviously they're the sections that you can trim down.
Okay. And here's someone here that quit their job a year ago, and they were going to go back to college September this year. They planned to travel, but because of the pandemic, they didn't. They just stayed at home with family and bunkered down like most of the rest of us did. That's, I suppose, of all the gaps to explain, that one is pretty straightforward and very understandable from an employer's
and I think we all did the same thing. I think we all hunkered down. So, I mean, probably in a few years' time, 5-6 years, I mean, you literally could just put COVID-19 pandemic, and I think it would encompass everything that happened during those 18 months. But again, it's more about now the next decision that you make and getting the momentum so that you're filling up your CV with good, relevant stuff going forward.
Yeah. Okay. And just interesting, just mention the pandemic there. We did a poll asking people, did they have an internship or graduate role delayed or cancelled due to the pandemic, and a flat 33.3%. So it's a third of the people were in that boat. So to that person there, there's a lot of people in exactly the same boat. And they are unique and unprecedented times. Listen, we're over time, so I just want to thank everyone for attending today's chat, and most of all, I want to thank Carmel for such accessible insights, I suppose, that we can all take away and use and remember the lemon. And listen, thanks everyone. And this presentation will be available on the platform for the next 7 days, and after that we will be putting it on our YouTube channel, so you will be able to dip back into this again. I think it's definitely worthwhile. Okay, thanks a lot, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much, everyone. Bye.
Bye.